of California Innocence Project. California Innocence Project was founded in 1999. I'm going to hand it over to Justin to give you a little bit of background on California Innocence Project, the mission, the goals, and to go over a few stats with you that are shocking, just given the current events today. And then we'll get into the fireside chat and we'll do some Q&A at the end. So without further ado, I will welcome Justin to take over. You'll recognize him from the video.
Hey, good morning. Yeah, that video was an amazing night. I've been fortunate enough to be able to walk more than 30 innocent people out of prison during my career. And Guy Miles was certainly one of the most emotional after working for 15 years on that case, which is the mere fact that it took 15 years to get him out of prison is something worth talking about in terms of justice reform and all the obstacles. But to talk about the California Innocence Project and why it got started, 25 years ago, I read in the newspaper about a young Puerto Rican woman on death row in Chicago. And the article said that she was sentenced to death on a plea bargain. And when I read that, I thought, how can that be possibly true that she got the death penalty on a plea bargain? There's certainly not a bargain in that. That she got the worst sentence she could have had, and she had no trial. So I went out to meet with her on death row, and at that time I was teaching law school in Michigan, and she told me this story that now has resonated so many times over the last 25 years of how her lawyer did no investigation into her case, told her best option was to plead out and gets mercy from the court. And she said, and I'm innocent. I didn't do this. And so I was teaching criminal law. I stood up in front of my class and said, there's this young woman on death row. She's scheduled to be executed. She says she's innocent. Who wants to help me out? And 4 brave souls raised their hand. And I started working with those students to undo her wrongful conviction and death sentence. Just sitting in my kitchen, going through the police reports, going out to the crime scene. We found the actual killer. We established that she was the one who did the killing. We established that the eyewitnesses were lying. One of the eyewitnesses was a girlfriend of one of the victims, which was never reported. All these problems with the case. And working on it inspired me in 2 ways. That, number one, there were innocent people in prison who needed help that wasn't there for them, that the government, everyone had kind of left them behind after they lost their trials. And that the best way to train law students to be great lawyers was to work on real cases. And by taking these students out to the crime scenes, bringing them into the prisons, teaching them how to interview witnesses, teaching them how to do crime scene analysis firsthand was really the only way they were going to know how to do it and understand the implications of not doing it. And that inspired me to start the California Innocence Project. I quit my faculty position in Michigan to the chagrin of my wife, gave up my secure position, and started what was then just this very small foundation with just me and a half-time assistant and a whole lot of boxes of mail. And for the past now, 20 some years, we've been investigating cases of wrongful conviction like Guy Miles. And now we've built ourselves up. I've got 9 lawyers who work full-time for me. I've got a giant number of students who work in the project, hundreds of volunteer lawyers that take a look at cases. We get thousands of letters a year because California is in the country with the most people in prison. California is the state with the most people in prison. And we've had all kinds of problems over the years with corruption and all kinds of things that have led to wrongful convictions. So that's basically the story of California Innocence Project. So here's some stats that we've put up here on the board. Thank you. That looks at the DNA exonerations in the United States. And those are really the gold standard exonerations, which is why we have a website devoted to them. There's been 367 total DNA exonerations. 61% of them are African American. When you go to our annual conference, every year we have the people who've been exonerated walk up on the stage, and every year It's a whole lot of Black people who have been wrongfully convicted, and ultimately were lucky enough to get the resources to get them out of prison. Even though, as this shows, Black people make up 13% of the US population in terms of incarceration, in terms of policing in those neighborhoods. It really starts with, there's excessive policing in Black communities. There's more arrests that occur there. Poor people have difficulty making bail. They end up in pretrial incarceration at much higher levels, and they end up getting convicted at much higher levels. The most telling statistics that we look at are when you look at race of the victim. Race of the victim is one of the two most important factors as to whether you get the death penalty in the United States. And it's basically, did you have a good lawyer? Did you kill a white person? Because if you had a bad lawyer or you killed a white person, you're most likely to get the death penalty. And that's where we see really, really shocking statistics. Here you see innocent Black people are 7 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted of murder, according to the National Registry of Exonerations. And 222 of the 362 people proved innocent by DNA. It's really, really crystal clear. There's not a debate about, does race impact the criminal justice system? The statistics pan that out.
Great, thank you, Justin. Let's go into a few questions. So we talked a little bit just now about the stats regarding racial injustice and what it means to be Black in the justice system. I know you sort of rattled off a few stats and the reasons why, but anything else to share about why those stats are so high?
Well, you know, I go to my own personal experience with it. When I started practicing law, it was in DC in 1990. In that time, DC was the murder capital of the world. And every single day, there was a young Black man who was killed in DC. Every day. And every day it was in the metro section. And whenever a white person was killed in DC, it was in the front page of the Washington Post. I always like to point that out because the Washington Post is known as one of the most liberal papers in the country. I don't think there was any necessarily racist intent in that. But I think that's really what's at the heart of when we talk about systemic racism. I had somebody tell me the other day, they tweeted to me that they love the Brian Banks movie, which Brian Banks is, you know, one of our clients who was exonerated and ended up playing in the NFL, but didn't feel that it was about systemic racism because Brian was Black, but his lawyer was Black and his probation officer was Black, and there were all Black people involved in the case. And that's just such a simplistic view of racism. Systemic racism doesn't really matter who the actors are. It's about the system. And when the Washington Post is putting when Black victims are killed in the metro section and when white people are killed on the front page, there's now more interest in those cases. There's more pressure in those cases. They've become news stories. Often district attorneys are politicians who are running for office. So the more people care about something, the more attention it gets, the more justice is going to be in those cases. And in other cases where people aren't as interested, it gets done in the dark. And I think that's just one simple example, but I like it as an example because I don't think there's any intent there. It's not, I think people's vision of racism and criminal justice is a racist cop with a nightstick beating up a Black man. And obviously that's very explicit racism. But it's more the subtle stuff that's gone on in the system that's the result of hundreds of years of building into the system and people's psyche. And I just think there's a normative thing where the majority of population in the United States is currently white. It won't be forever, but that's what it currently is. And when you have a justice system with a jury system, people always relate more to people of their own experience. It's just a simple principle called matching. And I use it, by the way, all the time in my investigations, and I teach my students how to do it. If a witness is wearing a Lakers jersey, I tell my students, tell them what a great Lakers fan you are. Because as soon as you're a Lakers fan and they're a Lakers fan, now there's an identity connection and they're more likely to open up to you. So people connect with people of common experience. And so when jurors, white jurors, are looking at a black defendant, they're less likely to connect. And the same thing is across all races. But white is the majority, not just population, but in the power structure in the United States. And therefore, it's just obvious that's what happens. It's obvious. And I can't believe we're still debating it at any level instead of thinking of ways, how can we mitigate this problem?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And it's sad that that's the way it is. But the work that you guys are doing on justice reform, I think, we're starting to see, a little bit of change in the right direction, which is great. We saw the Guy Miles brief clip, which is heart-wrenching. And it's so great to see that the work that you are doing is leading to exonerations and wrongful convictions like Guy Miles. Can you talk to us a little bit about a few exoneration stories, maybe even Guy Miles?
Sure.
Give us a little bit of background on that case.
Yeah, well, Guy Miles is an excellent example to talk about how race impacts the criminal justice system. So Guy was in Las Vegas at the time a bank robbery happened in Orange County. He'd actually never been to Orange County before. And this bank robbery, it was actually a savings and loan. It was done in almost a comical way where this one individual, he had financed his car through the savings and loan. And every time he went in there, he realized that they had drawers full of cash. So he tells his two friends, let's go rob it. And they go to rob it, and he says, well, I can't come in. I'll have to be the wheelman because they know me in there. And this individual had such a short attention span that he got bored while he was waiting while the robbery was going on. So he sees an auto parts store. He goes in there and he starts asking about purchasing auto parts for his car. The robbery occurs. The guys run out to the car. The worker in the auto parts store actually looks through the window and says, hey, I think your friends are trying to get back in your car. And he'd locked the door. And so he runs back out and they take off. Of course, the sirens go off. Everybody in that little strip mall goes outside. And the people in the savings and loan said, yeah, we just got robbed, and describes how it went down. And the guy in the auto parts store said, yeah, this guy just came in who was with them. And he describes him. And very quickly, they discovered this guy's a guy named Bernard Teamer. They go to his house, arrest him. So they immediately get him. And now they try to figure out who are the other two individuals. The police officer who put the photo array for identification purposes together to try to identify the two other suspects just put black men from the neighborhood where Bernard Teamer came from. And the only person actually matching the general description given by one of the witnesses was Guy Miles. It was two white employees at the savings and loan that made the identification. And more than half of the innocent people I've walked out of prison due to bad identifications were identified by cross-racial identifications. There is nothing inherently racist in that, even though sometimes it is racist. It comes down to the fact that when you're born, you start developing your facial recognition software. And if you're looking at your mom and looking at your dad, after a little while, you can distinguish between those two faces. And then your sisters and your brothers and anyone else you're exposed to. If everyone you're exposed to is of the same race, for the rest of your life, you will not be good at identifying people of other races. Because every year, the first 5 years of our lives, our capacity decreases to learn. That's why without good preschool education, we can't really reform education in the United States. And sadly, when you get to my age, it's impossible to learn anything new. But that's a process that we go through with our brains. And so we find in our cases that cross-racial identifications are almost always wrong. And then when you add to it, the officer putting together this photo array with just people that don't even match the description, So therefore, Guy is the only one that comes close to the description. He's going to get identified. Now, when we went to court on this, it was an interesting learning experience for me because I cross-examined the police officer who put together the photo array. And in my head, I was thinking, this guy didn't even care who got caught in this case. He just figured a bunch of guys from this neighborhood, it's a gang-ridden neighborhood, maybe we'll get one or two gangbangers off the street. Who cares who they are? Interestingly, as I'm cross-examining him, I'm realizing that this officer doesn't even know what he did wrong. He didn't understand the basics of how to put a photo array together. And after a fairly brutal cross-examination by me, he came over to counsel table and said, if Guy Miles is innocent, I really hope you guys win. I didn't intentionally try to do anything wrong here. And I believe him. And that's where it comes into this conversation we're having now about training. That yes, there are these horribly racist people that need to be taken out of the criminal justice system, but that doesn't solve the systemic problems. Like, we need to have better training. We need to identify these problems and start to remedy them. And that was just a perfect example of that. Race also impacted the case because when we brought the habeas petition, during the trial, one of the witnesses said that one of the other suspects looked like the rapper Warren G. And when we tracked down the guy who committed this crime, he really did look like Warren G. Same facial structure, kind of had an oval-shaped head. A lot of the description was very accurate and didn't match up with Guy Miles at all, ultimately. And I remember vividly, I put up on the wall these two photos for the judge to look at, and it was an elderly white judge, and he could not see the distinctions and clearly just dismissed that whole line of argument. So, you know, race impacts every part of a criminal justice system, and as a natural extension of the fact that we have a majority population that's white in the United States, it has to have impact. If we recognize it, we can start to mitigate it. But yeah, it put Guy Miles behind bars for 18 years, and he had the greatest alibi you can have. I wasn't even in the state at the time, and he had 12 witnesses that put him in Las Vegas at the time. And in fact, during the trial, the judge, and again, do I know whether this is explicit racism? I don't know. But I know that the 12 witnesses were all black, and after hearing 3 or 4 of them, the judge said he'd heard enough, that it was redundant evidence. And that, I thought, how is this redundant evidence? These are each individuals who are testifying where the judge should weigh their credibility. And maybe one is not that credible, but maybe witness number 9 is super credible. And he was just sort of like, okay, you got a bunch of people to say you were in Las Vegas, moving on. So we see this stuff, you know, every day in our cases.
So it's something you said, I'm going to jump around in the questions a little bit because I want to hit on it. You mentioned, and thank you, Justin, that's a great story about, I mean, it's not, but it's great to hear that Guy Miles was freed and all of the work that you did to show that he should have never have been charged in the first place. It's really, really heartbreaking to hear that that even happened. So you mentioned better training. Just given the police, you know, lineup that was false from the very beginning of this case. So when we talk about, you know, defunding the police and, you know, where could we better use that funding? Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, certainly there's some of my friends on the left who believe we should just abolish the police. And that's a hashtag, and there's people who feel very strongly about that. But I think the majority of the people who are talking about this idea of reform are talking about shifting resources away from the police. I read a New York Times article yesterday that took a look at what percentage of time do police spend on violent crimes. And in almost every jurisdiction, it was fewer than 5%. In San Diego, where I live, it was 1%. So we're sending out people with weapons trained to utilize force to deal with situations where only 1% of the time it's a violent crime, or under 5% nationally. Most of the time, they're responding, actually, it was more than a third of the time, to non-criminal actions. So things that aren't even criminal. And another third of the time, they're dealing with traffic, things like that. So I think the idea is, we should have really highly trained police officers who are doing the specific tasks, like trying to solve a violent crime, that we give them way more training and shift resources to that, and then shift resources away from the police department altogether to other agencies who can deal with situations like a homeless person is lying in my front yard, or the millions of things they get called out on every day, even domestic violence, having people who are better trained at dealing with those situations. If you look at the rest of the world, nobody does it like we do. Nobody is sending out armed people for every situation that they have in the community. The police have just become the call about everything, and it's not the way to do it. And we also have much less training than our European counterparts. In places like Great Britain, they have to have training for a couple of years, whereas here it's a few months. So we have less training. Are we the worst in the world? Absolutely not, because I work in Latin America every day. So I actually oversee 25 innocence organizations in Latin America, and I trained the first 12 public defenders in Chile after the fall of Pinochet long time ago. I was asked in the last Mexican presidential election by one of the big supporters of one of the candidates of what I would propose for Mexico to help their criminal justice system. And I said, I have a very simple plan. Fire half of the police department in Mexico, double the salary of the other half, and shift some money into training, because they pay police so little in Mexico that nobody cares about losing their job. They can make as much money at McDonald's. And that's why they take bribes. That's why there's corruption. There's no training going on. So I've seen the extreme, but the lesson for the United States is similar in that the more training, the more resources allocated to the right spots, the better job we can do. And I think we should look to the European models of criminal justice, where they're really doing a much better job than us. They have lower recidivism rates in their prisons, lower incarceration rates in their populations. They're not as focused on punishment as they are on making people better. They're much more pragmatic. Whereas in the United States, our criminal justice system is so dramatically politicized. I mean, every day, the President of the United States calling this week for prison time for flag burning, that kind of stuff. We're constantly blowing these whistles and throwing red meat to the populace. And then we're left with one of the wealthiest countries in the world, which we live in, having the highest incarceration rate in the world. And that makes no sense. And having the most people in prison, having more people in prison than China, when they have 1 billion more people than us. So I think we've really come to a place after decades of bad policy that we're in this kind of situation. And I'm so excited about the conversation over the past month. However depressing it's been, we're talking, and that's what we need to do.
That's great. That's great to hear. And on that note too. So, what is your POV, Justin, on where time spent lobbying for change, for this sort of action and reform and wrongful convictions? How is that best devoted? Is that at the local level? Is that your state level, federal? Can we talk a little bit about, where would we see change and how can people get involved? I think a lot of people think that it is at the federal level, but we would love to hear from you as the expert on this.
Yeah, it definitely is not at the federal level. Absolutely, we need reforms for federal prisoners and federal crimes. We've seen a lot of racial disparity in federal sentencing for drugs, for example. But the overwhelming majority of the criminal justice system is at the state level and then at the local level, at the county level. We're one of the only countries in the world that has a different penal code operating within the same country. And we have 50-some separate penal codes. We have every state, we have the District of Columbia, we have the federal penal guidelines, we have incredible number of things going on. And jurisdiction to jurisdiction, those laws are different. They reflect the culture of the state. A lot of people say the reason the United States has lasted as long as it has, which isn't very long in the history of most countries, but it's because we let Texas be Texas, we let California be California, we let New York be New York. So that notion of federalism is a key part of our democracy. And so what we're left with then is every state has to work on their own state laws. And then locally, the county district attorney has tremendous power in terms of what cases they're going to prosecute, what sentences they're going to ask for, how policing is done in their community. Acting locally is what people have to start thinking about. And I'll give you a simple example about that. We've been preaching at the California Innocence Project now for 2 decades about reforming identification law so that people in Guy Miles' situation don't get convicted. And we've known, because studies have shown us for decades, that the principle of using 6-pack photo arrays doesn't work. That when people look at these photo arrays, something happens in their brain where whoever looks most like the suspect, the ones who don't look like the suspect, will start convincing you that is the suspect. And there's this incredible amount of studies to show that these photo arrays do not work. We went around for the last 20 years educating police departments and went county by county in California, getting them to change their procedures. Los Angeles County, which is the largest county in the United States, refused to change what they were doing. They even ended up paying more than $100 million in civil suits of cases where they wrongfully convicted people based on these photo arrays. And we could not get them to change. We could not educate them into change. And ultimately, we lobbied, and Jasmine Harris is on the line here. Jasmine does lobbying in my office and does policy work. We finally got the state legislature to actually change the law and force them to stop doing their ID procedures the way they were doing them. And now they've changed. So that's what has to happen. It has to happen at a local level, at a state level, when you fail at the local level. But who you vote into office as a district attorney really defines what's going on in your local criminal justice system, because there's lots of laws that are on the books that some, DAs will enforce and others just won't. There's a book out there that's like, I can't remember what it's called, but it's something like 1,000 Ridiculous Laws. And it says, like, in Arizona, it's illegal to buy a triple ice cream and walk down the street with it. And it's stuff like that. School teachers aren't allowed to be out with skirts that don't cover their knees. So there's things that are actually still on the books in the United States and not enforced. And then you get other little counties where crazy stuff is going on, and they're not only enforcing those laws, but they're giving big penalties for them.
That's really, really interesting to hear. And it's great to hear that, the legislature is being passed thanks to you guys for actually doing that work. How often do you find misconduct by the police and by prosecutors?
There's the question of how often we find it and how often it happens are probably 2 very different answers. Yeah. It's very difficult to find. And that's one of the things we're really pushing for with legislation is more disclosure, more transparency in how things are going. That's a big thing we work on in Latin America is transparency, but we still haven't really hit it in the United States either. It's, for example, in California, it's practically impossible to get a police officer's record of prior complaints and prior abuses. They fight aggressively against ever releasing that information. So that's very difficult. We don't have open discovery laws that give us access to everything going on in the case. My office, we're pushing to get copies of police reports when we're working on cases post-conviction. The trial attorneys get those police reports, and then we pick up the case 20 years later, and the trial attorneys have thrown everything out, and we can't get copies of the police reports. It's very hard for us to investigate cases without those police reports. There's the best example of that that I've worked on is the Mike Hanline case. And if you search YouTube for a video called "Man Eats Hamburger After 36 Years," you can see an amazing video about him being released from prison finally. But it took us years just to get the record open in that case. My associate director, Alex Simpson, in my office, he litigated that for years just to get access to the file. And then it took us years. They've just fought us every step of the way. And when we finally got all the information, it was incredible how much corruption was within it, how the district attorney's office was involved, police were involved, all in setting up our client. Ultimately, they had to settle with our client for millions of dollars as a result. So he was not just released from prison, but he was ultimately received a settlement from the county. So is every officer corrupt? Is every district attorney corrupt? I don't believe that. I believe in the bell curve for all of life. That whether you're talking about a plumber, talking about a school teacher, you're talking about a Google employee, whoever you're talking about, there'll be a percentage who are unbelievably great at their job. There'll be most of us that fall into the good to okay range. And then there'll be the horrible and the corrupt. That are a small percentage. So I believe, yes, there's district attorneys and police officers that fall into the horribly corrupt. There's more of them that fall into the okay category that don't do a great job that we need to find out. But they probably get up every day and try to do the best that they can. I think at 55, I've come to that conclusion. If you'd asked me that question when I was 25, I would have had a different answer, which would have been much angrier and said that everybody's against me. So, but I think that's a more realistic view of what's going on.
Absolutely. And I think I just read, was it in New York City? Is it 50A, 51A that was just passed recently to give more more, I guess, transparency into police records, to hold them accountable. Okay. So we're getting there.
And this is a great time for people to go out and start pushing for that at the state, again, at the state level. It has to happen at the state level. This is a moment in time where I think a lot of state representatives want to be able to say to their constituency that they're doing something to respond to what's going on. Yeah. So I don't think in my lifetime I've seen a better time to be pushing for legislation and getting on top of it, because usually we're just screaming into the dark where nobody cares about criminal justice issues. It's absolutely low priority, and right now it's not.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, power in numbers too, and people are ready to take action. So that's great to hear that that people can actually take action, and we can see that action with people pushing at their state levels, like we did in New York City with that statute pass. Mm-hmm. So getting into a few other questions on some of the success stories you guys have had with exonerations. So I'm sure you get tons and tons of cases per year with, people that claim to be wrongfully convicted that do want your help, as we saw in the Brian Banks movie. So how do you go about selecting which clients to take on?
So yeah, that is the hardest part of the work. We receive thousands. When I first started the California Innocence Project, I naively thought, well, where am I going to get cases from? Because in Marilyn Malero's case, I read about in the newspaper, I went out to the prison to meet with her. I was proactively seeking that case out. And then the Los Angeles Times did a little editorial saying, welcome Justin Brooks to California and the California Innocence Project. And since then, the mail has not stopped. It's been relentless. Actually, I can see Jasmine there sitting next to a pile of mail, actually in our office. So no, the other side. So it just comes in every single day. So then what cases do we pick? So, after doing this for a long time, some of it is a smell test. Some of it we know by looking at the case that it's a particular county where a lot of wrongful convictions have happened, or it's a particular case that deals with the kind of issue where we've seen a lot of mistakes, like a conviction based solely on an identification. We know that there's tons of flaws with identifications, so we pay close attention to those cases. But every single letter that comes in has follow-up. So we have law students who read the letters, put them into the system. We send out questionnaires to the inmates. They give us all the information on the case. Students are then calling the trial lawyers, calling the appellate lawyers who worked on the case, reading through the transcripts, looking at the briefs that were filed on appeal, and they do an intake memo on the case to see, is this a possible case for us? Then the next step is thinking, can we develop the evidence we would need to win this case? And that's where the heartbreak happens. And I'll tell you, it's so heartbreaking that I told my staff last year, I don't think I can do it anymore. I've been doing it for so long that I don't think I can sit through another presentation where I hear a horrible set of facts, where I'm pretty confident this person could be innocent, and yet at the end of it, I have to say no, because I don't think we can do anything about it. And that's actually at the heart of the Brian Banks story and movie. The screenwriter spent a lot of time with me, and I talked about that issue of how depressing it was that I started feeling like maybe I'm being conditioned towards failure, because I look at a case and I start thinking, I've seen so many of these cases fail. I don't see a way we're going to get this reopened. I don't think the judge is going to care about what we have. It's really a heartbreaking process. But if we think we have any chance, fortunately, there's other people in the room and not me who say, let's go for it. Let's see what we can do. And we push them forward. And it becomes like a funnel where it goes from thousands of cases that come in the office to hundreds where we're thinking, maybe there's something here, to tens where we actually develop evidence on the case that's winnable, to the now 30-some people that we've been able to walk out of prison after we've proved it to a judge. But everyone I've gotten out of prison, I've always looked at them and thought, man, however unlucky their life was up until this moment, they are the lucky ones right now, because there's so many hurdles to get over where, you got to first get a lawyer to care about your case, and then they got to be able to develop evidence in that case. And then you got to get a judge to want to take time out of their calendar to put a hearing on. And then at the end of that, they have to have the political courage to go against the district attorney's office, often go against the police department, and free someone, which is extraordinary in our system. And a lot of our judges are elected, and a lot of them are appointed and have political connections they need to maintain. So there's so many hurdles that we know it's just the tip of the iceberg. The people we've walked out of prison, and now nationally, we've identified almost 3,000 cases of wrongful conviction. To know to work in my life every day, that's the tip of the iceberg. And that's the hard part of it. It's not 3,000. And that's why when politicians, I remember George Bush II saying that he loved the Innocence Project because we were making sure no innocent people were ever executed. And that's just a joke. That's not true. We're not the safety net for the entire system. We save the individuals we can, but that net has a lot of big holes in it. And that's the tough part of the job.
Yeah, and on that note, and you talked about Marilyn Malero, who was actually on death row, and you were able to overturn her wrongful conviction after spending, a couple of decades
almost 3 decades
incarcerated. Yeah, and so it's really hard to believe that, just given the volume of cases that you said are innocent, much less being able to prove that they're innocent and overturn those convictions. How do we still have a death penalty here in America?
Yeah, every time I hear somebody say, well, if you knew someone who was murdered, you'd have a different point of view of it. I think, yeah, if you sat in a jail cell with someone who was facing the death penalty who was innocent, you'd also have a different viewpoint on it. And I think politicians have done such a poor job with the death penalty, particularly Democrats, in terms of how they respond to that question. If I'm asked, would you want the death penalty if your wife was killed or your children was killed? My answer would be, I probably would. But I'm an angry, sad, grieving crime victim. Is that really what our government should be? Should our government respond in that emotional way? I mean, you wouldn't let me on the jury, would you? So obviously I'm clearly biased. And I think Democrats I've seen over the years back away from that question. I think you can just take it straight on and say, yes, as an individual, that might be an emotional decision that I might say, but that doesn't mean it's what we should be doing. We have to be pragmatic as a government. We have to look at how many innocent people have been sentenced to death. We have to look at the extraordinary cost of the death penalty. We need to look at international human rights law and the fact that we're the only Western democracy left doing this. There's all these things that should factor into legislation and what we should be doing as a country. But again, criminal justice is the most politicized area of the law. You know, when my colleagues who teach contracts law or law of the sea, they don't have to deal with all these inconsistencies because smart people sit in a room and come up with those laws. In criminal law, it's some posturing, state rep who wants to get some votes from his confused voting population and is trying to manipulate and use people's fears and anger to get votes. And therefore, we don't have the smartest people in the room creating the best laws. That's the reality of it. And I don't think anybody could with a straight face deny that. I think they might say it's okay, but you can't deny the fact that our criminal justice system is based in politics, and politics is often based in fear. So you scare people into the death penalty. You scare people into sentences of life without parole, even if they've done 3 minor felonies and we know they're going to be okay. It's a lot of fear that builds into that. And so we have a lot of inconsistent laws. And if anyone actually studies the death penalty, there's literally, to give you an example of that, there's almost no scholarship that's pro-death penalty. If you want to get published, I've said this before to students, when I get published in a law review, write a pro-death penalty article, because there isn't any. Because there's no scholars that actually study it except for a handful who've come to the conclusion this is a good idea for our society. There's really no net gain to it. Yeah, it's all bad.
That's really sobering to hear. Let's see. Thank you for that, Justin, for answering all of my questions. Let's turn it over to the door and see if there are any other questions from those on the live stream. There are. Let's see. And there are a bunch. So let's just start from the top, from Sarah. As someone who isn't a lawyer and is just getting involved in justice reform, what can we do to make an impact on our local levels? Do you have any tips on how to lead constructive conversations on this with our peers? So I know you talked a little bit about getting involved at the local level, but Sarah would love to even understand how she can start leading this. How can she get involved and then lead others to do this? Where can she start?
Yeah, those are great questions. So first of all, on the local level of getting involved in work, our project, you can find at CaliforniaInnocenceProject.org. And, we're in San Diego and do cases in Southern California and have lots of volunteers. You can find another Innocence organization in your area by going to InnocenceNetwork.org. And there's obviously lots of criminal justice reform projects to get involved in. In terms of leading constructive conversations, I think the key to that is having facts. And there's so many great facts that are available. Like if you go to deathpenaltyinformation.org, they have such incredible, undeniable statistics about the death penalty and the problems with it, that then that conversation can be constructive. I think conversations that are based purely in emotion and how people feel and who they like don't go anywhere. I think conversations that begin with statistics and then ask the question, why did this happen, can become constructive. It's sort of like my mentor. I ran a prison clinic at Georgetown a long time ago, and my mentor there, who was helping me write law review articles, said, it's not a good article unless it's a legitimate question. So I think people have to have statistics and then ask legitimate questions, like why is this happening, and not starting with their opinion, but moving towards that with actual facts.
Absolutely, that's great. Let's just scroll down, and this might be a little bit similar, but Shashi, sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. Currently, there's a lot of focus on police reform, as we discussed. Do you think justice system reform is also being talked about enough? If so, what are some of your favorite ideas? How do you encourage this conversation?
Well, if it's not being spoken about enough right now, then it never has been spoken about enough, because my feed, I've never seen my feed on Twitter and Facebook be 95% about criminal justice reform. It's normally about, people talking about their cheese sandwiches and their vacation that they're on. So it's certainly the time to be having the conversation. I think, again, I don't think we should be getting into conversations that instantly end with this us versus them idea. I think we recognize the fact, for example, that police reform has to happen, and we start thinking about realistic ways to make that happen. Do I feel a kinship to my colleagues on the left who think we should abolish the police department based on the anger and things they've gone through? Absolutely. I 100% get it. And I know that if I'd gone to prison for a crime I hadn't committed and a police officer had set me up, similarly, how I'd feel if my wife was murdered, I would have a response to that wouldn't necessarily be what's best for society. And so I think we need to really stop, examine what the problems are, be thoughtful about it, and not make the same mistake that politicians have led us down of having just emotional responses because they sound good and because they get me votes. Again, going back to the example I gave earlier, the president of the United States saying send people to prison for burning flags is exactly the kind of problem we've had for 30 years, where we're seeing solutions to our problems being incarceration. Whatever's going on, lock them up, and now lock them up for longer, and now execute them. And we haven't seen the problems go away. So let's start to abandon failed policies of the past and start to really look, how can we solve these problems?
Absolutely. Lots of questions here about people asking how they get more involved. So I'm going to combine the next two questions from Ziggy and Chloe. So Chloe has a question around how the formerly incarcerated, what resources are available to them to assimilate back into society after they're released? Are their records expunged, housing provided, jobs, etc.? How do people get involved at the local level to provide support and resources? And then Ziggy asks, how do you better vet the DA? What kind of research can you do on the DA to better evaluate them?
Both great questions. So when I started the California Innocence Project in 1999, the maximum amount you could get when you were released from prison and found to be innocent was $10,000. And to do that, you had to basically file a lawsuit against the government. So nobody got it. Lawyers weren't taking on those cases, and it was a ridiculous amount of money. Since then, we have had our compensation law changed multiple times due to the great work of my staff. And now in California, you're entitled to $150 for every day you were wrongfully incarcerated. We also, and this is crazy, we had to fight to get legislation to get our exonerees the same benefits that parolees get. That's how messed up our system is. People who'd committed crimes and gone to prison and got released on parole were getting benefits that we couldn't get for our clients who were exonerated and released because they were innocent. They didn't even get the gate money that you get, which is like a couple $100 to get a bus ticket and a night in a hotel after you're released from prison. And the reason is because we kind of, we're disruptors in the sense of we come in and we pull people out of the system and then they don't know what to do with them. Whereas they've set people up for parole. There's still a lot more work to be done on this. I think if people, again, go to CaliforniaInnocenceProject.org, you can see the stories of our clients. And a lot of them have struggled. It's been hard to get the compensation. That's why we've had to change the law multiple times. The Attorney General was for years fighting us on every one of those claims, so we had to litigate them. We had to spend huge amounts of staff time and money to litigate those claims when it was supposed to be almost an automatic process. So it's difficult when our people get out. They don't have resources. A lot of them, their family has disappeared or passed away. They have to adjust to a brand new world. They've never seen the internet before because prison doesn't allow them access to that stuff, and they struggle. And you can see those stories on our website. In terms of what should you look for in a DA? Well, most of these county DAs were line DAs before they ran for office. And I think what we just need to do is almost like everything with a politician, look beyond the rhetoric. Look beyond the rhetoric. Look at their record. Look what they did. Look at the sentences they were asking for in particular cases when they were making those calls, because that's the kind of county DA they're going to be. And if not for, human rights reasons, if not for altruistic reasons, do it for financial reasons, because we're paying a lot of money to keep people in prison and serve these long sentences. If you look at California, in the time we built 30 prisons, we did not expand our education system hardly at all over the past several decades. If there was an unlimited amount of money, then yeah, you could afford to put everyone in prison for the rest of their lives, but we can't. So we shift funds from one part of government to another. And you can see very clearly in California how we shifted money away from education into prisons. And now we have the largest prison system in the United States. So it's asking those hard questions. You can see that going on right now as Joe Biden is trying to select a running mate, how people are really scrutinizing the records of those VP candidates. And, it's there. The information is there. It's just how deep we go to look for it.
Absolutely. There are a lot of questions left, and we only have about 3 minutes, and I want to save a minute at the end just to wrap up and let people know how they can immediately get involved. So maybe one more question on the Dory, and maybe a live question if anyone has it on the live meets. So let's see here. So there's a bunch of questions, I think, here on accountability. So when we talk about the police, when we talk about the DA, when we talk about the prosecution, everyone involved, right, in these cases where someone was wrongfully convicted. And as we saw with, I think, Brian Banks with the movie Just Mercy, there is no accountability. There's no prosecution for these people that have wrongfully convicted these innocent people who have spent years and years and years incarcerated. So what's being done on that front, and how can people get involved in just accountability for those people? Do they, can they recertify to them become police once again, or prosecutors? Do they lose their licenses indefinitely? I think that's really hard for people to grapple with.
Yeah, well, if people follow me on Twitter at Justin O. Brooks, you will see me talking about this a lot. For the first time ever, we are talking about getting rid of immunity for the police department in civil suits. And first of all, judges have total immunity, prosecutors have total immunity, and police officers have qualified immunity. It's impossible to sue a judge or a prosecutor, and it's practically impossible to go after a police officer unless the behavior is so outrageous and it can be proven that it was so outrageous that it goes outside their work altogether. So we're finally seeing some reforms in that. I'm hoping that's going to happen. I'm hoping we're going to get some reforms in terms of access to police records, but it's absolutely correct that there's been almost no repercussions to wrongful convictions on the behalf of the police or the prosecutor's office. It was sort of troubling to me when the Duke Lacrosse case came out, that's one of the only cases on record where you saw the DA actually lose his law license. And I don't want to say it was because they were rich white kids from New York, but they were rich white kids from New York. Our clients, they did some little time in jail. Our clients go to prison for decades and have no repercussions, even when we've established clearly that there were abuse in those cases.
Great, thank you, Justin. And I know there's so many more questions to answer, but I think honestly, looking through the Dory, the majority of people want to know how can they get more involved, which is great to hear. So aside from, we talked about just getting involved at the local levels, there's also volunteer opportunities with California Innocence Project. And if you're in other states, the local Innocence Project in your states, donations. So any kind of donations really go towards all of the great work that CIP is doing to get pro bono lawyers and to collect DNA and expert witnesses and things of that nature. And And then if there's anything else, please reach out to me. I'm happy to connect with Justin and the CIP team offline to send over resources such as anything that you can read up on at the local level, any kind of research, things of that nature to get more involved in the legislature side of things. And I'm happy to follow up with all of those resources and the recording of this and the deck afterwards. So with that, yeah, thank you, Justin. This was great.
Thanks for getting the word out. As you just said, we're an operation that all donations go directly to services. I'm a full-time law professor. I take no money from the project. We're housed in a law school. They pay our overhead, but we have all these expenses to investigate and litigate these cases. So every dime that's donated to us goes towards us helping an innocent person get out of prison. So I hope people will go to CaliforniaInnocenceProject.org and see our story.
Thank you so much. This was enlightening, I think, on a number of levels for myself and hopefully everyone else on the call. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for all of the work that you're doing, and you're truly an inspiration to all of us for all of the great work that you and your team are doing. So again, thank you so much for being here and taking out a whole hour out of your day to be here with us.
It's a pleasure.
Great. Thanks, everyone.